connect with one another. All right, now finally, I would love to invite up Pastor Alison. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you, Nara. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alison. I'm the lead pastor here at the River. It's so good to be here with all of you celebrating Easter. Welcome to those of you who are physically here in the room today, and also welcome to those of you who are tuning in via live stream. So, to start, I have a question for all of you. Has anyone ever shared a compliment with you that made you stop and think for a moment? To ask yourself, is that really true about me? Anyone had that experience? Yeah. I had an experience like that this past week. A very kind member of our community was sharing with me about how one of my recent sermons had helped them to feel more hopeful about life and the world. And I really appreciated this person's kindness. And at the same time, their words gave me pause. I had to spend some time really thinking about them. The reason I was caught off guard is because, truthfully, I haven't always considered myself to be a very hopeful person. To illustrate a bit of what I mean by that, growing up, I was a big fan of Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. These days, I find myself relating more to other characters in this story, but as a child, I really saw myself in Eeyore. For those of you who are less familiar, Eeyore is the donkey who says things like, "The sky has finally fallen, always knew it would. It's the only cloud in the sky, and it's drizzling right on me. Somehow I'm not surprised. End of the road, nothing to do, and no hope of things getting better." I've always had a bit of a fraught relationship with hope, in part because my experiences of life and the world have shown me that hard, painful things do in fact happen at one point or another to everyone. And at least for me, pretending like that's not true has just made the hard times even harder. Because of this, for a long time, I didn't think of myself as a very hopeful person. I considered myself more of a realist, is how I would put it. But as I thought about it this past week, I realized that maybe I need to update this story that I've been telling about myself. Upon further reflection, I realized that perhaps I actually am a hopeful person. And the reason I feel like I can say that with integrity is because my understanding of hope, the way that I define it now, has shifted significantly. What I've come to believe is that hope is not the problem. Hope, I've realized, is vital, both for survival and for any chance of creating a world where all people can flourish. It turns out that the actual problem, the thing that I truly can't stand, is cheap optimism. Philosopher, theologian, and political activist Cornel West describes cheap optimism like this. He says, "Optimism deodorizes the catastrophic. Hope gives us strength to deal with the catastrophe." What a vivid description. Cheap optimism masks the odor, but it doesn't actually address the source. It's like we're spraying Febreze in the air while pretending that the rotting garbage isn't sitting on the ground in front of us. Hope, on the other hand, does something different. It tells the truth about the garbage, and it gives us the strength to deal with it. Hope, not cheap optimism, is essential. We cannot live a meaningful life without it. German theologian Jürgen Moltmann said this, "Totally without hope, one cannot live. To live without hope is to cease to live. Hell is hopelessness. It is no accident that above the entrance to Dante's hell is the inscription, "Leave behind all hope, you who enter here." Many of us here have experienced the hell of hopelessness around the state of our world in response to situations in our own lives. Hope is not always easy to hold on to. So I'd encourage you, wherever you're able to find it, to try to grasp onto it and hold on to it as tight as you can. Personally, in my own life, my faith has been something that I turn to as a source of strength, inspiration, and hope. I really value the spiritual practices that help me to connect with God's Spirit and that help me to more fully embody unconditional love. And time again, I find myself drawn back to Christianity's claim that resurrection is possible. Some may argue that belief in resurrection is a form of cheap optimism. And the truth is that too often it has been employed that way. It has been weaponized into forms of toxic positivity and spiritual bypassing, into destructive narratives that conflate God's redemption with God's intention, claiming that God plans or purposes or wills or intends suffering for some higher purpose. I strongly believe that this kind of harmful theology strays far from the truth of God's unconditional love. And I believe that it does so unnecessarily. As open and relational theologian Thomas J. Oord reminds us, victims needn't say thank you, God, because evil occurred. It wasn't God's will, but they can believe God works in every situation, trying to squeeze good from the bad that God didn't want in the first place. In every circumstance, even in or perhaps especially in the awful ones, love is working for our good and for the good of the world. That is just what love does. We can believe this without making God the author of our suffering. Resurrection hope is not cheap optimism. It does not enable us to escape pain and suffering. It does not allow us to outrun the ache of being human. And it does not guarantee that specific outcomes will come to pass. But it does tell us that life can come out of death, that beauty can emerge from ashes, that mourning can turn to joy, that whatever awful this we find ourselves in is not the end of the story. Cornel West describes true hope as being blues inflicted. To understand what he means, it might help to share a bit of context around the blues. So these quotes, they come from episode 3 of a series called Rivers of Rhythm. The seeds of the blues were very long ago planted in the music of Africa, but harvested in the fields of the Deep South. It was the pain, the sorrows, the struggles during and after slavery. They gave the blues this central structure and its emotionally complex sound. Blues aesthetic is that message of encouragement in a tough time. That's kind of the ethos that the music comes from, is this idea of struggle. In those struggles, there is a line of hope and pain that intertwines. Hope and pain that intertwines. So West argues that true hope, as opposed to cheap optimism, is infused with the blues sensibility. He says, by hope, I mean blues-inflicted hope that is morally sound. Hope learned and earned in the harsh realities of daily struggle. Hope that remains on intimate terms with death. Hope that is life-renewing. For hope to be morally sound, it must be learned and earned in the harsh realities of daily struggle. It must remain on intimate terms with death. Only then can it be life renewing. Separating hope from death, from suffering, from daily struggle, from catastrophe, robs it of all of its power. For hope to mean anything, it must always be intertwined with the blues. And this is the reason why the stories of Jesus' resurrection are so powerful and life-giving. Because in them, we find the hope of Easter intertwined with the grief, the shock, the paralysis, the despair, and the silence of Good Friday and Holy Saturday. Earlier, some of our youth shared a beautiful story from the Book of Belonging about the resurrected Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene. That retelling was inspired by passages in all 4 of the Gospels. But now I'd like us to take a closer look at the resurrection stories as told specifically in the Gospel of Luke. I think that they offer us some helpful clues around what resurrection actually looks like and feels like, how it shows up in our lives and in the world in ways that differ from cheap optimism. In Luke, there are 3 resurrection stories. The first one, found in Luke 24, 1 through 12, picks up on the 3rd day. On that early morning, a group of women made their way to the tomb where Jesus had been buried. These women had been with Jesus for a long time, all the way back to his time in Galilee. As Jesus and the 12 male disciples traveled from town to town, these women were there too, using their own financial resources to support all of them. I think that's such an interesting detail that often gets left out or overlooked. The women, they brought spices and ointments with them to help care for Jesus' body. Before the Sabbath, they had seen his body in the tomb. They knew where it had been laid. But on this morning, the stone was rolled away, and he was missing. The passage says, while they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen." These angels, as they're later identified, shared the shocking news that Jesus had risen, that he was not dead, but alive. And so the woman returned to where Jesus' followers were gathered and told them everything that they had seen and heard. Unfortunately, those who were gathered did not believe the women. The passage says that they considered the woman's words to be an idle tale. It seems that believing woman has always been a struggle. However, one among them believed that the woman's story was worth investigating. Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home amazed at what had happened. In the next story, found in Luke 24, 13 through 25, 2 of Jesus' followers were in the midst of a 7-mile walk to a town called Emmaus. Earlier that morning, these 2 individuals had heard the woman's stories about the empty tomb. They'd also heard from others in their group who'd visited the tomb later in the day. They were astounded by the stories, but in the end, they'd concluded that it was time to leave. An empty tomb was not enough to go on. Nobody had actually seen Jesus alive. It was time for them to get back to their lives and to their homes. The passage tells us that on the way, while they were walking and talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Jesus asked them what they were talking about, and for a moment, they stood still, looking sad. Then they shared everything. They shared about Jesus, about their hopes that Jesus was the one to redeem Israel, about the events that led to Jesus' death, about the woman and the angels and the empty tomb. They walked and they talked for miles and miles, and Jesus spent time explaining the scriptures to them, essentially saying to them something like, "You are missing something here." When they reached the village in the evening, the two urged their companion, who they still did not know was Jesus, to stay the night with them. Jesus agreed, and they all sat down to eat dinner together. Then something amazing happened. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That very same hour, they got up and returned to Jerusalem. And when they arrived, they found where Jesus' followers were gathered. And they learned that while they had been away, Jesus had appeared to Simon Peter. Excitedly, they shared that they too had seen Jesus. The verse says, they told what had happened on the road and how Jesus had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The final resurrection story, found in Luke 24, 36 to 49, picks up right where the previous one ends. As all who were assembled discussed the events together, Jesus appeared to them. The passage says, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and terrified and thought that they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you frightened? And why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I myself. Touch me and see. For a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. Yet for all their joy, they were still disbelieving and wondering. And he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. So what do these three stories help us to understand about resurrection? What clues do they give us about what resurrection looks like, or what it feels like, or how we experience it? I would love to share some of what stood out to me. And after this service, I'd be curious to hear what stood out to you in these stories. So what does resurrection look like? Resurrection may not look like what we had initially envisioned or hoped for. The resurrected Jesus looked in some ways like a ghost, not exactly like the man who had walked with them. Jesus' followers had had specific ideas about what it would mean for Jesus to redeem Israel. In the end, there was redemption, but it did not look at all like what they'd had in mind. That gap between our hopes and our new reality, even a good one, can be hard to navigate. Sometimes, in order to appreciate what is, we must first grieve what isn't. Because resurrection shows up in ways that we may not expect, sometimes we can look directly at resurrection, stare it in the face, and not recognize it for what it is. Sometimes all we need to do is to adjust our expectations in order to see clearly, but other times, in order to recognize resurrection in our midst, we need an outside perspective to help us understand what we are missing. We saw that on the road to Emmaus. At times, we may discover that resurrection begins with absence instead of presence. That before we can encounter the risen Christ, we must first explore the empty tomb and examine the discarded linen cloths. At times, we may come to realize, just like the woman, that without knowing it, we are looking for the wrong thing in the wrong place, that we're looking for death instead of life, or that we're looking for the living among the dead. What does resurrection feel like? According to these stories, sometimes resurrection feels like being startled or terrified or frightened, or like being filled with doubt, disbelief, wonder, and perplexity. Joy may emerge as things become clearer, but it does not erase all of our other emotions. In the third scene, the passage says, "Yet for all their joy, they were still." They were still feeling so many other things as a result of all that they had gone through, all that they had lost. Resurrection brings new life, but it does not erase scars, and it does not reverse time. Like the blues, with resurrection, hope and pain intertwine. What is it like to experience resurrection? Well, these stories show us that it's not always easy. Resurrection can be hard to believe and hard to trust. It can be hard to believe what you yourself are experiencing, and sometimes others will have a hard time believing you as well, like we saw when the women first shared their experiences. At times, resurrection may seem like nothing more than an idle tale, unworthy of pursuit. One thing that can help us to understand resurrection more deeply is embodiment. In Emmaus, it was in the breaking of the bread that the two were finally able to see Jesus clearly. And looking back, they realized that their hearts had been burning as they spoke with Jesus on the road. In the presence of resurrection, their bodies had been giving them clues worth paying attention to. And their embodied practice of breaking bread together, that helped them to connect to forms of knowing that went beyond what they could grasp intellectually. Embodiment was also important in the third scene. As a way to work through all of their complex emotions, Jesus invited them to look closely at him and to touch his body if they wanted to. To help them understand, Jesus asked for food and he ate a fish in front of them. It seems that when it comes to resurrection, abstract intellectual knowledge is not enough. It seems that we need firsthand embodied experiences. Finally, in these stories, we see the ways that resurrection hope can be energizing and can inspire action. When the woman returned and shared their story, Peter got up and ran to the tomb. When the two followers on the road to Emmaus finally realized that it was the risen Jesus who had been with them, that very same hour they got up and journeyed all the way back to Jerusalem, even after walking all day. In both situations, the hope of resurrection energized them to take a step forward. I mentioned earlier that hope is not always easy to hold on to, that wherever we are able to find it, that we should try to grasp it and hold on to it as tight as we can. So to close today, I'd like to explore some practical suggestions that may help us to do this together. First, I'd like to encourage us to avoid succumbing to the lure of cheap optimism. If we are to avoid robbing hope of its life-giving power, then it is essential that we remain acquainted with death, with the blues. This may mean literally listening to the blues, but really anything that allows us to be honest about what's real and to make room in our lives for lament will work. Second, I'd like to encourage us to be intentional about looking for signs of resurrection. When you start intentionally looking, you'll discover that cycles of life and death and new life are all around us. you can find them in nature, in the daily cycles of the sun rising and setting, and of creatures waking and sleeping, in the monthly cycles of the moon waxing and waning, and in female fertility, in the yearly cycles of the changing seasons, summer, fall, winter, and spring, in the caterpillar's metamorphosis into a butterfly, in the low-intensity forest fires that clear the way for new growth, in the ways that decomposition imbues ecosystems with fresh nutrients. You can also find signs in people, in the people who embrace the changing seasons of their lives, daring to reinvent themselves, in the people who seek to heal, to break cycles, to establish more life-giving ways of moving through the world, in the people who find ways to keep going after loss or to rebuild after tragedy, in the people who have suffered and who still make room for softness and for joy, in the people who have refused to let violence or oppression diminish them, in the people who keep fighting for a better world even when progress is not visible or guaranteed. We need to practice intentionally looking for signs of resurrection, because if today's stories are to be believed, oftentimes we are blind to the resurrection that's happening right in front of us. Finally, I'd like to encourage us to embrace hope as something we do, not just something we feel. Christian ethicist David Gushee wrote an essay earlier this year about what had helped him to snap out of what he described as helpless hopelessness. By the way, Dr. Gushee, he will be coming here to the river to speak in October, on October 4th. You won't want to miss it, so put that date in your calendar. But anyhow, in his essay titled "Helpless Hopelessness is Disempowering," Dr. Gushee reflected on how he had been able to move through a period of helpless hopelessness about the state of American democracy and the world at large, and had recently found ways to become reacquainted with hope. Dr. Gushee wrote, "Helpless hopelessness is disempowering." Contrast that helpless hopelessness with this line from Gloria Anzaldúa: "Voyager, there are no bridges. One builds them as one walks," which may mean that at least if one has the power to do something constructive, something at all, anything really, to give in to hopelessness is irresponsible. If you don't see a bridge to a better world ahead of you, start walking and build it as you go. Keller quoted bell hooks to this effect: "To be hopeful is to be responsible for the future." Ultimately, the strongest indicator of hope is our actions. And sometimes we need to act in ways that are hopeful, even if we don't feel optimistic. If, as Christians, we truly claim to believe in resurrection, if we believe that it makes a difference that Christ is risen, then we are invited to honor that belief by taking responsibility for the future, by clinging to the conviction that new life is possible and refusing to accept that this is the end of the story, by choosing to invest in progress that we may never see, or at least may only see in part, by deciding to start walking where no bridge to a better world currently exists and agreeing to build one as we go. That is what it means to live a life filled with resurrection hope. Resurrection hope was costly for Jesus, and it's costly for us. Yes, it's blues inflicted, but it's for that very reason that it has power, that it's so incredibly beautiful in its honesty and its resilience. In a world that seeks to numb us with cheap optimism, I pray that we would refuse to settle for anything less than the real thing. That we'd refuse to settle for anything less than genuine resurrection hope. At this point, I'd like to invite the worship team back up to the stage. And to close, I'd like to offer this prayer from Cole Arthur Riley. God of complicated hope, we confess that we have made for ourselves a dainty hope. It is difficult to accept the hope of inspirational quotes when we see the traumas of this world clear and constant. Many of us have had language of hoping in God wielded against us as a way to keep us from the lament and anger and justice we were meant for. Protect our hope from toxic positivity, that we could name the truth of our deepest longings and face a waiting marked by pain and want. We believe. Forgive our unbelief that what is will not always be. Help us learn to allow our dreaming to be a deep, guttural groan, a promise that we can recline into, a place where we can catch our breath. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.